Anyone remember the Harry Potter games? I loved the first 3 games in the series, particularly the second one, as it was the first proper Harry Potter game I played where you could explore the castle. I remember renting the Philosopher's Stone on the PS1, but we only had that for a few days, so I don't remember too much about the game itself. I was also given the Game Boy Advance version for Christmas, which I loved. The soundtrack for that game still gives me such a nostalgic overload every time I hear it. But the game I loved the most was the Chamber of Secrets on the PS2. This was the first proper Harry Potter game we had growing up, and I played it every chance I could. I've chosen to remake the Gnome Throwing section at the start of the game, as I used to love this minigame. The feeling I had the first time I got to explore the burrows was unmatched at the time, and I'd spend hours throwing gnomes to see how far I could get them. The first thing I had to do was get the Harry Potter model, so I went onto the model resource and found this model here. This is actually from the Prisoner of Azkaban, but I thought the model from the Chamber of Secrets looked a bit outdated, so I decided to use this one. This model came with a bunch of textures, so once I imported them into Unreal, it was just a matter of setting up his materials and applying each of the textures to the material and then applying that material to the character. Once I was happy with how Harry looked in the game, I created a character class that would allow me to configure things such as movement and the camera. I adjusted the initial variables to be used for Harry, and the basic implementation was configured. I created a blueprint from this class so I could place Harry in the scene. I then adjusted the camera to where I wanted it to be and set up the bindings so I could map the movement functions to the input from the project settings. The next thing I had to do was implement the gnomes. I found a gnome model online, again on the model resource website, but there were no animations with this character, so I set up a very simple human rig and binded this to the model. Unfortunately, with how the hand was situated on his stomach, I needed to clean up the bone weights for the character so I could give the gnome independent use of his arms. So I spent a good bit of time painting weights until I was happy with how the skin moved with the bone structure. I then needed to give Harry the ability to pick up the gnomes. I did this by creating a capsule collider for the gnomes. Then, if the player entered the vicinity of this collider, the gnome could be picked up as long as they weren't already holding another gnome. I attached the gnome to the player character by creating a socket on the skeleton mesh and assigning the gnome to this socket in code. I had already implemented the basic walking and idle animation states for the player, so I had extended this by adding animations for when holding the gnome as well as when walking with the gnome. Thankfully, the Harry model that I downloaded came with over 15,000 keyframes of animation, so I didn't need to create any of the animations myself. Otherwise, this would have been a very different game, as I have no animating skills whatsoever. As you could see here, the holding animation looked a little awkward, so I edited the animations in Unreal, moving the bones until I was happy with how it looked in game. I wanted to add some simple animation for the gnomes where they're waving their arms in the air when they get caught, so I created a very basic animation for this in Maya and modified it in Unreal so that it would play when the gnome was picked up. Once this was done, I needed to implement the throwing mechanic. I figured I would need to do this by applying a force to the skeletal mesh, but unfortunately the gnomes aren't using physics at the moment, so I configured a mechanic that would enable physics for the gnomes as soon as the throw button is pressed, and then apply the force in the direction the player was facing. Now that the throwing mechanic was configured, I needed to find a way to keep record of how far the gnome was thrown. I did this by configuring an invisible barrier between Harry and the garden. Once a gnome collided with this barrier, it would calculate the distance between the gnome and the barrier itself. I then rounded this value down so that I would only calculate the distance in whole numbers. When spinning the gnome in the PS2 game, there was a trail that came from the gnome. I tried to replicate this by using Unreal's Niagara particle system. The trail isn't exactly the same as the one in the game, but it was sufficient enough for this demo, I thought. The next thing to do was to try and put a level together. I found this Burrows model on 3D Warehouse, but it was an SKP file which unfortunately doesn't open in Maya, So I found a plugin by SimLab which converts SKP files to FPX, so I signed up for a free trial and converted it with no issues. This allowed me to apply the textures and import it into Unreal. I then started work on the UI. I found a screenshot from the game online and used GIMP to extract the icons. Once they were imported into Unreal, I created a blueprint widget and placed each of the icons in the window until I was happy with how they were positioned. I added the names for the scoring and modified the blueprint for the game mode to set the widget to display when the game begins. The last thing to do was to create a binding so that the distance variable would be bound to the HUD element and update accordingly when the gnome crossed the barrier. As the model was from Harry Potter 3, the cloak did not look how it does in the PS2 game, and I wanted the cloak to be fully black with a red trim. So to do this, I opened the cloak texture in GIMP, painted over the texture and re-imported it into Unreal, which gave me the look I was after. I then created an animation state that would cause Harry to faint if he spins around for too long. A spin timer has been configured so that the player will spin faster the longer the button is pressed, so I created a max timer variable that would cause Harry to faint when this was reached. I decided I wanted Harry to be able to cast a flupendo spell to try and be as faithful to the PS2 game as possible. This involved creating a timer so that a spell could only be cast once the timer has been exceeded. Once the spell was cast, the timer would then be reset. I created another binding and assigned this to the cast function. I downloaded a wand model and modified it in Maya so that it was oriented correctly in Unreal. I played around with the positioning of the wand on the mesh until I was happy with where it was. I created a socket on the skeleton mesh and assigned the wand to this socket in blueprints. I didn't attach this one in code as I won't be changing any attributes for the wand, it'll simply be used for the visuals. I downloaded a particle pack from the Unreal store and found a particle that I thought suited the flupendo spell well. After this, I needed to place Ron, Fred and George in the scene. Luckily, these models also existed on the models resource website, so I started with Ron. Thankfully, the UV mappings for all of these characters were the same as Harry, so I was able to apply most of Harry's textures to Ron without having to make any big changes. For the Fred and George models, no animations were provided, so when I tried to create and bind a new bone structure to the existing Ron skeleton, there was a lot of issues with the animation positions. So instead, I decided to duplicate the Ron mesh and all of the animation and simply copy Fred's head onto the new body. This then binded successfully and allowed me to use the existing animations for Fred and George. Then it was just a matter of applying the pre-existing materials that were already used for Ron and Harry. I scaled the model slightly and modified the position of the cape until I was happy with how they looked in the scene. Throughout the burrows, you can find a number of beans scattered around, so this was the next thing I was going to work on. I downloaded a model and a bunch of textures that are used in the game and decided to use 4 of them for the purposes of this demo. I ended up applying the textures directly, however if I was doing this for a production product, I probably would store all of the textures in an array and choose one at random when the game starts to save a lot of the manual work I put in for these 4. I wanted the player to have the ability to collect the beans, so I started work on the UI for this next. I created a variable to keep track of how many beans were picked up and bound this variable to the text widget on the UI so that each time the player collides with a bean, it would be added to the score. The last thing I did for the beans was to try and give them some more flair in the scene, so I added some particles. I matched the colour of the particles to whatever colour the bean was, and lastly I added some logic for the bean to bounce up and down as well as spin in place. The landscape was the next thing I began to work on. I created a landscape material with all of the materials that I wanted to use in the scene. I started to paint these materials throughout the level to try and replicate the look of the burrows. I then created some assets using some of the foliage packs from the Unreal Marketplace and placed them throughout the level. I added some depth by raising the terrain so you couldn't see into an endless void. There are a number of obstacles to try and hit, so I began placing some hay bales around and created a very basic target texture using GIMP. I attached these to the hay bale models so that the player would have something to aim at. I started placing assets around the scene to try and flesh out the empty space. I wanted to replicate how cluttered the burrows is. Originally, I was manually placing these assets before remembering that Unreal actually has built-in functionality for placing foliage around the scene. So after wasting a lot of time manually placing these assets, I eventually switched over to this. This made it a lot easier to achieve the look I was after. At this stage, the demo was more or less complete. I had working functionality and I was happy with how everything looked in the scene. I wanted to have a short message that greeted the player on start, which explained the rules of the game. To do this, I found an image of one of the UI hint boxes from the PS2 game and replicated this once again in GIMP. After this, it was simply a matter of creating a UI widget for it and populating the panel with text. I needed to freeze the controls so the player couldn't move around while this widget was active, so I created some basic functionality in the game mode blueprint that set the time dilation to 0 until the player started the game. Fred, George and Ron all felt a little static in the scene, but thankfully they all shared the same skeleton as Harry, so I retargeted the skeletons and gave them an idle animation. I also wanted them to react if you hit them with the flupendo spell, so I gave them a flinching animation and added a sound cue so that they would react when they were hit. I knew that Unreal had cloth simulation in the engine, so I tried to remove the static animations that were applied to Harry's cape and use Unreal's cloth physics instead. However, I believe there was an issue with how the animations were baked into the model, as I couldn't get the cape to behave normally. As you can see here, it just became a bit of a mess, so I reverted back to using the baked in animations. And that was the game complete. I added some post-processing effects and populated the scene with a bit more until I felt I couldn't add to it anymore. I was happy with how it turned out. I loved this section of the game when I was younger, and I would love to see this game, as well as the trilogy, get a full remaster. But please feel free to download the project and try it out for yourself. I haven't optimized the settings at all for this project, so I've no idea how it will run on lower end machines, but if there's enough downloads, maybe I'll revisit the project in the future and add some additional settings further. Thanks for making this far into the video. Let me know if you thought of the Harry Potter games when you were young. They definitely pull a nostalgic string for me. As always, please subscribe if you liked the video and check out some of our other projects we've done. We'll continue to make more of these videos in the future, so hit the like button and leave a suggestion for what we should do next. See you in the next one.